Hunter or Blackguard, Commoner or Malefactor, Tailor or Clockmaker. Which class to pick? Which class is the best? This is the question I'll try to answer in this video. In my last essay video, I talked about classes being a bit underwhelming and wanting more unique class-defining traits. It generated a massive amount of discussion in the comments section. I appreciate all of the input and large variety of opinions on the matter. This birthed an idea of doing a breakdown of every single positive and negative trait in the game, once and for all, putting some real numbers behind the community's feelings about each class. So I sat down and tested every single mechanic and exclusive recipe. I had only a cursory understanding of many traits, and it was fun to see some actual numbers and analyze the impact of each trait on the overall gameplay. I recorded everything into a spreadsheet and then wrote this script. In the first part of the video, I will test every single positive and negative trait to the best of my ability. In the second part of the video, I will break down my overall feelings on each class and rank them from the worst to the best. I will be doing two distinct rankings, the early to mid-game capabilities and how the classes fare in the late game. This video is thoroughly timestamped, so if you want to skip to your favorite class or go straight to the rankings, feel free to do so. One thing of note, many traits repeat across the classes, so if you don't see me testing something for your favorite class, it's probably because I have already tested it earlier. I started with the Hunter's traits and went down the classes as they are presented in the game. So without further ado, let's smash each class into subatomic particles and find out what they're made of in the Advanced Class Picking Guide for Vintage Story. First positive trait on the Hunter is Focused, which gives the Hunter 20% range damage, 30% range accuracy, and 20% range distance. I tested the Hunter against the Commoner with no bonuses and the Blackguard with the 15% damage reduction. To kill a hare with the Copper Spear, both the Hunter and the Commoner required one hit, while the Blackguard needed an extra one. This makes hunting hares a lot less viable with the 15% damage reduction, since they're fast, like to flee, and blend into the environment. The boar took 3 hits from the Hunter and the Commoner, once again showing no difference, with the Blackguard requiring an additional hit once more. The Corrupted Drifter took 5 hits from the Hunter, while taking an additional hit from the Commoner, and another additional hit from the Blackguard. The Brown Bear is where the variance was really starting to show, requiring 10 hits from the Hunter, 12 from the Commoner, and 14 from the Blackguard. Certainly, the difference of 35% range damage between the Hunter and the Blackguard is very evident in this test. To test the 20% range increase on the Focus trait, I aimed directly at the 5th block on a 5-block tall column and recorded the average distance. I replaced the Blackguard with the Malefactor since he suffers a 25% range penalty. The Hunter averaged 28.5 blocks, while the Commoner averaged 25, with the Malefactor coming severely under at 17.5 blocks. I found this test pretty surprising. The difference between the Hunter and the Malefactor is almost 50% in terms of capable range. The range accuracy portion of the trait was a bit problematic. I could not figure out a good test for it. My best guess is that it influences the spread of the projectiles as it relates to the center of the targeting reticle, similar to many FPS games that have bullet spread on most of its weapons. However, the bunching of the spears did not draw a conclusive picture. After all this testing, I can proclaim that Focused is a very good trait on its own. Moving on to the Resourceful. This trait offers 10% increased animal loot and 25% increased animal harvesting speed. I was harvesting animals with low body weight for consistency and used the Commoner with no bonuses and the Tailor with a 10% reduction to the animal loot. I was surprised to see virtually no difference in the loot from the rabbits. All 3 classes tested managed to harvest 3 small hides from the 5 rabbits. Meanwhile, the Commoner and the Hunter pulled 7 pieces of red meat out of the rabbits, with the Tailor surprisingly managing to get 9. This was counterintuitive, but shows that with such small percent increases to the bonuses, you can get almost identical results from the smaller yields. None of the classes managed to get any fat. Next, I repeated the process with 5 boars. Again, the difference between the fat and the hides acquired was almost non-existent, averaging at 1. I think this has to do with the small sample size, and over a large sample, you would notice a 20% difference between the Hunter and the Tailor. The meat amount is where the Hunter pulled ahead massively with 38 pieces of meat. The Tailor once again somehow beat the Commoner with 28, and the Commoner only pulled 26. It seems that the variance for the smaller yield items is not significant, and for the larger yield items like meat, it felt a lot stronger. I also measured the speed of harvesting. The Hunter and the Commoner produced identical times in harvesting 5 boars with a copper knife, with 33 seconds each, and the Tailor did it in 39 seconds. I don't think harvesting speed is going to make a huge difference to your experience regardless. Overall, I was very underwhelmed with the Resourceful trait. I suppose if you're hunting a lot, which you probably would be with the Hunter, it's a nice little bonus. Fleetfooted trait, on the other hand, which increases the movement speed by 10%, is very good. The Hunter walked the 110 block track in about 29 seconds, while the Commoner managed to do this track in 26 seconds, pretty much on par with the 10% increase. Running showed similar results with 13 seconds for the Hunter and 14.5 seconds for the Commoner, again showing 10% difference. Backpedaling backwards produced identical results to moving forward. However, when I tested a full steel plate armor setup, the Hunter walked the track 7 seconds faster. Surprisingly, this is more in line with 15% boost to the movement speed. This also persisted for the run portion, as the Hunter was 4 seconds faster, which again is in line with 15% advantage. It appears Fleetfooted is even better trait when wearing anything that slows you down. The Blackguard has a trait that reduces the speed penalty of wearing armor by 25%. I decided to test it and discovered a bug. ? This being on version 1.20.3. I investigated the movement speed bonus and discovered that not only was the Blackguard not faster than the Hunter, he was in fact slower than the Commoner by about 5%. Not only does this trait not give you additional movement speed while armored, it currently makes you slower, and my tests confirmed it. Yikes. I finished the test by seeing if the speed buff affected swimming and rafting. Neither got a speed boost from the trait, which makes sense. 10% movement speed is very important in this game, since traveling on foot is something you'll be doing a lot. The biggest advantage of this bonus, however, is that it helps the player to outrun most threats in the game. I tested this out against the bear. So does this help you to outrun the bear? Yes, absolutely and unequivocally so. The bear easily catches up to the Commoner and does not stop chasing, resulting in certain death, while the Hunter easily outruns the bear and slowly grows the distance between the two. The movement speed bonus also makes backpedaling against all kinds of enemies easier, and backpedaling is a very strong combat tactic that trivializes most enemies in the game. Overall, Fleetfooted is an S-tier trait that is relevant at all stages of the game. The Hunter has 3 exclusive recipes: crude bow, crude arrows, and the best ranged weapon in the game, the recurve bow. The crude bow and the arrows are easily craftable and could come online as early as the first day, so I took the bow for a spin to see what it felt like. The rabbit alone took 4 arrows to kill. This makes the crude bow completely useless for hunting in my eyes. The surface drifter took 6 arrows to the knee, while the boar also took 6 hits to die. I don't think there's any reason to use it over a spear. This was with all the Hunter's range bonuses too. Imagine using it on another class with none. I have never crafted a crude bow before, and after this test, I don't think I ever will. The recurve bow was a different story. I used the steel arrows for this test to really see how well a ranged character could perform in the endgame. I was pleasantly surprised with the performance. A bear could only take 9 shots from the recurve bow, while a double-headed drifter went down in 7. A steel falx, on the other hand, could only kill a bear in 15 hits, and 13 hits for the double-headed drifter respectively. This has a lot to do with the 15% melee damage reduction on the Hunter though. However, even on the Blackguard with the 30% melee damage bonus, a bear required 10 hits, and the double-headed drifter died in 8, which is less damage than the recurve. I then tested the regular longbow on the Commoner, a recipe accessible to everyone. The amount of required hits per target went up by 2, which still puts it over a steel weapon, which required 2 additional hits over the longbow. Only on the Blackguard did both of these weapons lose out to a steel weapon by about 2 hits. In all honesty, I didn't know the bows are so competitive on the top end with the melee weapons. Next trait was Farsighted, which reduces the Hunter melee capabilities by 15%. Which I of course tested when investigating the bow damage against the melee. Thus, I moved to testing Claustrophobic, which negatively affects the ore drop rate by 15% and mining speed by 10%. I lined up 20 copper blocks and tested the speed of mining between class bonuses, and then also compared the ore amounts. The Blackguard, with his 10% bonus to mining speed, managed to work through these blocks in 44 seconds, while the Commoner did it in 49 seconds and the Hunter in 53 seconds, showing about 10% difference between the classes, which of course tracks. I then repeated the same test with the steel pick and was surprised to see that the steel pick nearly doubled the mining efficiency with 21 seconds for the Blackguard, 23 for the commoner, and 25 for the hunter. The verdict: real-time saver here was getting better tools, with the bonuses only marginally useful. When it came to the ore gains, the Blackguard pulled 26 pieces of copper ore, the commoner pulled ahead with 29, and the hunter was way behind with 21. This seemed to be above 15% by a significant margin. Once again, due to the sample size, I'm sure. Regardless, unlike the mining speed, this does appear to be a significant downside, but mostly affecting the copper to iron transition, as bronze alloys are the usual bottleneck and come in tiny amounts. I don't see it making much difference long term, however, especially because iron tends to spawn in huge amounts, and 15% reduction is virtually inconsequential once you make it that far. Concluding with the hunter traits, I moved on to testing the Malefactor, starting with the Forager, which increases the loot from foraging by 10% and the wild crop drop rate by 20%. For the foraging test, I lined up 20 cranberry bushes and gathered the berries with the Malefactor compared to the commoner and the Tailor, who has a 10% reduction to the foraging loot. The Malefactor harvested 96 berries, while the commoner got 89 and the Tailor got 80, which is about 10% difference. This bonus also supposedly works on mushrooms and sticks. The berry bonus is the most useful though. It could be very helpful in the first summer and the fall, while rapidly losing its relevance past that point. The 20% wild crop drop rate ended up being the standout trait. For this test, I had to go into the regular world and copy a square with some growing rye, since it's not something you can easily generate in creative. I ended up testing 20 units of rye, which were in the middle of their growth stages. The Malefactor scored 15 seeds, while the commoner scored 18, once again showing the power of variability. Where the rubber met the road was the Blackguard, who comes with a 20% reduction to the wild crop drop rate. He managed to pull measly 7 seeds, which is over 50% reduction from the Malefactor. Yikes. The pattern held with the fully grown wild rye as well. The Malefactor got 14 seeds out of 10 plants, outpacing the commoner who got 11, and the Blackguard coming dead last with 7, once again showing close to 50% reduction. The Malefactor also got the most grain with 32 pieces, while the commoner got 28 and the Blackguard got only 22. The big surprise here was the Blackguard with its 50% reduction. This is a pretty big downside. Imagine trying to start a robust flax farm in the early game and spending hours hunting down every wild flax plant only to get slapped with a 50% tax. Not great. Since farming is such an integral component to food security in Vintage Story, this seems like a big deal for early game. After testing the Forager, I switched to testing the Pilferer, which boasts a 15% drop rate from the cracked vessels, 10% rusty gear drop rate, and a 12% chance to collect a cracked vessel intact. To test the drop rate increase from the vessels, I had to do some modifications to the game. By default, the vessels drop a huge variety of loot, making testing impossible. I modified the JSON file to make the ore vessels completely static with 10 pieces of coal. I then placed 10 vessels and tested the amounts of coal. The commoner got exactly 100 pieces of coal, while the Malefactor got 113 pieces. This makes me think that there's some kind of randomization to the integer rounding in Vintage Story to maintain bonus consistency. If the rounding was always up or always down, we would see 120 or 110 pieces of coal respectively. I then changed the container to contain 3 rusty gears and repeated the test. I got 30 gears on the commoner and 33 on the Malefactor. I then also tested the Blackguard and only got 28 rusty gears. In general, this trace language is really weird. It boasts 15% drop rate, but doesn't state to what, unlike its Blackguard counterpart. Then, it claims a 10% bonus to rusty gear drop rate, but doesn't state from what either. To test this, I set the ore vessel drop rate to 100 gears and got 115 gears from it, in line with the 15% drop rate bonus. I then set a surface drifter to drop exactly 100 gears and saw 110 gears, in line with the 10% rusty gear bonus. To prove that it did not apply to anything but the vessel loot, I also tested a few chests inside of random ruins with the commoner, followed by the Malefactor, and saw no difference in loot. The 12% chance to collect cracked vessels works as described though. The benefit of collecting these containers is to sell them to the commodities trader. I spawned 10 traders and checked their inventories. On average, they bought 2.5 vessel varieties per reset from 6 existing ones. The vessels sell between 3 to 5 gears. This means that in the best case scenario, to make 20 rusty gears, you would need to find 50 cracked vessels and hope to collect 5 intact ones. Then it would take you at least 18 days to sell them to a single trader. This comes with extremely high variance of finding the vessels, getting them intact, finding the commodities trader, and then getting lucky on his resets. The Forager trait did not impress me unless you're doing something like the Arctic Survival Challenge, where the vessels are the only option for otherwise unattainable loot. Moving from the vessels, I tested the Furtive trait that reduces the animal seeking range by 35%. I tested the detection rate of bears and wolves. Malefactor had a huge difference in the bear detection range. He could come within 10 blocks of the bear without notice, while the commoner was spotted at 19 blocks away, which is almost a 100% reduction. With the wolf, the Malefactor seemed to only gain a single block of distance at 6, with the commoner coming behind at 7. So it did make a huge difference for the bear, but not so much for the wolf. The biggest advantage of the perk for me, however, was being able to kill the animals without them reacting to damage at all. Unfortunately, something must have changed with the patches. In fact, here's footage of me doing exactly this to the polar bears in my Arctic Survival Challenge. However, I could not reproduce this in 1.20. At minimum, the animals would react by running away, which defeats the point of this perk for hunting. And at worst, the bear would detect and charge me even at maximum spear throwing range. I have to rate this trait so much lower because of this. Next, I decided to play around with the sling, the exclusive craftable. It requires only a small pelt and some rope to craft, and uses loose stone as ammo. So in that sense, it was better than the crude bow. Just like the crude bow, it seems pretty bad for hunting though. The hare takes 3 hits to kill, and the wolf and the boar take 7, while the surface drifter takes 5. The fact that you don't need to nap ammo is nice. However, I can't rate this highly as it has pretty bad range and low damage. I don't see myself ever using it over spears, and of course it has no endgame potential unlike the high-end bows. Next, I moved on to investigating the negative traits, and the first one was Frail. Of course, I have already looked into the range distance reduction and found it to be rather impactful, but it also included a reduction to the hit points to the tune of 2.5. To test this reduction, I recorded the amount of hits it took to kill a naked character without any food buffs. The Malefactor could only take 2 hits from the wolf, but the commoner didn't fare any better, and only the Blackguard could take 3 hits with his 5 extra points of health. Same exact pattern repeated with the bear. The regular surface drifter killed the Malefactor in 6 hits, same for the commoner, and only the Blackguard could take an extra hit. In full steel plate, a double-headed drifter took down the Malefactor in 4 hits, with the commoner taking an extra hit. Finally, the Blackguard pulled ahead by a lot, being able to tank 7 hits. If anything, this shows the strength of the extra 5 health points on the Blackguard. In the endgame, when wearing full armor, it will make a significant difference, affording you 2 to 3 extra hits even from the toughest enemies. With the Hunter and the Malefactor out of the way, I moved to testing some of the Clockmaker's traits. I started with Precise, which is a 25% damage increase against the mechanicals. I tested this trait against the Soul Blade Locust first. The Clockmaker clocked the mechanical enemy in 7 hits, while the commoner took 8. The Blackguard, on the other hand, only took 6 hits to dispose of this threat. This disparity, of course, is due to the fact that the Clockmaker also comes with a 15% melee damage reduction, almost nullifying this trait. Also, I tested this against the Drifters and found that it does not work against them, despite the game's suggestion that these creatures have some mechanical components to them. So this trait is basically next to worthless in my opinion. I suppose this damage bonus is better if you decide to take a ranged approach, but then again, why not play a Hunter instead? Moving on to Technical, which reduces the temporal gear cost to repair translocators. A translocator normally takes 3 gears to repair, and this reduces it by 1. I personally have not found translocators to be useful, but some people swear by them. I can see them being useful in the endgame context, where you can create a robust network to travel to faraway places using translocators, such as the South or the Arctic. As far as early to mid-game, I have not found any problems that couldn't be solved traveling on foot. Of course, I have already tested the Fleetfooted trait, and it's simply good, just like it is on the Hunter. To me, this is the primary reason to pick a Clockmaker, but then the Hunter seems strictly better in every way if you want this trait. The exclusive craftable recipe on the Clockmaker is the Tuning Spear, allowing you to tame a locust to aid you in a fight. This recipe is not easy to put together, however. It requires a temporal gear and a bronze spear at minimum. This is not something you are likely to put together easily in the early game. Then you have to find a locust in the cave, and even then, sometimes you fail to tame the locust and kill him in the process instead. Once you tame it, it's borderline useless. It stood no shot against a high-level drifter and couldn't even save me from a wolf. Once the wolf decided to fight the hacked locust, the locust was toast, and this was the strongest locust version as well. So it seems to be only marginally useful against the weakest of the enemies, and even then, they can get stuck and despawn. For me, this is a hilarious novelty. Maybe if you want a mechanical pet to take care of, but its usefulness outside of that is practically zero. The Clockmaker's negative traits are a carbon copy of the Malefactor's traits, so click on the Malefactor's analysis if you skipped ahead. Moving on to the Blackguard. I have already tested the melee damage buff. It is significant and makes him the de facto melee class. Of course, the speed penalty reduction is currently bugged, so all that was left to test was the armor durability increase. I tested the armor durability against the locust while wearing copper scale armor in the chest slot. As expected, a successful hit on the chest armor reduced the durability by 5 points on the commoner and by 4 points on the Blackguard, which is about 20% reduction in durability loss. I don't think it matters that much though, but it could save you on the potential repair costs. I already tested Hardy before. The mining speed was marginal and nothing to write home about. The health point increase seems to be pretty significant in the late game, while not being that impactful in the early game. I tested the exclusive recipes next. The two exclusive recipes are the Blackguard sword and the Blackguard shield. The idea behind them is that you can get steel levels of damage and defense with iron. During my testing, I found that the Blackguard sword took on average one less hit to kill a double-headed drifter than the iron folks, but comparable to a steel folks. Something to note is that the sword is tier 4 damage, while the steel folks is tier 5 damage, so ultimately you still want to upgrade to steel, although I'm not sure if it has a lot of relevance in the current game. The steel shield, once again, was fully equivalent to the Blackguard shield, taking the exact same amount of hits to die from the double-headed drifter at 6 hits a pop, being 1 hit behind this mark. So what's the verdict on the exclusive craftables? They are a tiny boost in power over the iron equivalents while not providing any late game benefits. Moving on to Ravenous, probably the biggest downside of any class. 30% increased hunger rate is nothing to scoff at, making early game a lot more problematic. To test this, I timed how long it would take the commoner to lose 100 units of satiety while walking. I found that the commoner took 110 seconds while the Blackguard took 90 seconds, respectively. This translates to about 5 minutes worth of playtime per full 1500 saturation. This potentially translates to about an hour of extra playtime per 12 full feedings. So we are probably looking at 2 additional hours of playtime per 10 hours of gameplay without needing to eat. This is pretty significant and can make a large difference in the first 20 to 30 hours of the game for sure. Something to note, the difference shrinks a bit when stacking other hunger debuffs like armor pieces and wearing an offhand. While wearing full plate armor and carrying a lantern, the difference is slashed in half, only translating to an additional hour of gameplay per 10 hours. So in some way, this becomes less relevant not only with the amount of food you are able to produce, but with the more stuff you are wearing, which would be true for the endgame scenario. Of course, I have already tested the nearsighted trait, which reduces range damage, but melee is where it's at with the Blackguard anyway. The heavy-handed trait is also pretty bad for early game. While the loot from cracked vessels and the foraging debuff seem minor in my eyes and was tested previously, the 20% wild crop drop rate reduction is where this trait goes from whatever to yikes. It can significantly impact your ability to start a farm early and makes flax a lot harder to get going, which is a big bottleneck in upgrading a lot of the tech. The Tailor was the only one left, and it's one of the weirder classes suited more towards multiplayer if you have exclusive recipes enabled. The Clothier trait allows him to craft sewing kits and comes with a ton of extra clothing recipes. Sewing kits can be purchased from the merchants, and the clothing only has cosmetic value. If you care about the drip, I guess this is a class for you. All other traits were similar to other classes and were tested elsewhere. The Mender provides 10% armor durability, which is extremely minor and unimpactful. The Civil trait reduces the loot from foraging by only a minor amount as well. The Weak trait reduces health by 2 points and mining speed by 10%, which are again very marginal, and hopefully I proved this in my tests. Same goes for the Kind trait, which reduces animal loot and reduces harvesting speed. The downsides are all rather minor, but what sucks about this class is that it offers absolutely nothing in terms of positives outside of the exclusive craftables. Now that I looked at every negative and positive trait, it's time to make some rankings. I will first rank all the classes as they pertain to the ease of the early and the mid game. This will focus on how easy it is to start with a specific class from the ground up, and how challenging it is to progress through the technological tree. I see the early game as roughly being the first summer and the fall, while the mid game being the winter and the following spring. The absolute worst class to start a new playthrough with, in my opinion, has to be the Blackguard. The biggest downside of this class is a 30% increased hunger rate, which forces you to go out and forage a lot more frequently, putting you into more frequent danger and forcing you to provide for yourself more often instead of progressing up the technological tree. Of course, when you do go out and forage, you get slapped with a 15% decreased foraging loot. On top of that, you are unlikely to be slugging it out with the bigger animals early in melee, and while hunting with ranged weapons, you suffer yet another penalty with 15% decreased range damage. This might force you to start thinking about establishing a farming operation to provide sustenance, but then you run headfirst into the second biggest downside of this class. The 20% decreased seed drop rate makes establishing a good farming foundation a lot more taxing, requiring you to go out and look for more seeds. The whole package seems to be designed for you to struggle with food sustain early, which is a pretty big deal. The positives don't offer much for the early game. The increased health is nice, but still doesn't save you from a bear attack, and only offers an extra hit against most enemies while naked or wearing light armor. The mining speed is mostly inconsequential, as is the armor durability. The melee damage is nice and can be rather impactful when dealing with the drifters, since you are much more likely to fight surface drifters in melee. The exclusive sword and shield come a little too late in the progression and don't offer a ton of advantages over the iron varieties. So overall, I have to rank the Blackguard in the last place. The second worst class to start with has to be the Tailor. The negatives are actually not particularly impactful according to my testing. However, there are no positives here that are worth talking about. The exclusive craftables are only cosmetic in nature, and the increased armor durability is inconsequential. So a few minor downsides, but zero upsides, make the Tailor an easy choice for the second worst starting class. The Tailor is probably the worst overall class, offering nothing in the early, mid, or late game. At least the Blackguard is a powerhouse in the end, while the Tailor remains useless throughout. The third worst class to start with, in my opinion, is the Commoner. I know this might be a hot take, but I think the fact that the Commoner has no downsides does not make up for his lack of any positive traits. There is nothing here to suggest a strategy or to help you establish yourself in the early game, and also there are no exclusive craftable recipes. Sure, that's the whole point, but you can get going a lot faster with other classes. The upsides of the top 3 classes easily make up for their downsides. The Commoner, though, gets nothing. It's a vanilla flavor of vintage story. We are finally getting into the top 3, and in the third place is the Clockmaker. This class would have ranked a lot lower, but the saving grace of this archetype is the Fleetfooted trait, which grants 10% movement speed. As widely agreed and tested in my video, the movement speed is a great counter to a lot of threats. Simply, enemies can't keep up if you choose to run away. Besides that, traveling is something you will be doing a lot in this game, and this trait remains relevant throughout. The downsides are not entirely bad, although the range distance reduction is pretty painful. The health pool reduction is minor, and the melee damage reduction, although felt, can be worked around. However, there is not much else here outside the movement speed. The damage against mechanicals is extremely niche and gets nullified by the reduced damage and the range capabilities. The exclusive craftable is hilariously bad, not even remotely worth using. The translocator trait I just can't see being that useful, and every other class can repair them too, not like it's exclusive to the Clockmaker. If it was the case, it would be a different conversation. The second place goes to my personal favorite class, the Malefactor. He could have competed for the top place, but unfortunately, what I thought was his best trait, the decreased animal seeking range, seems to have gotten nerfed. You used to be able to outrange the animals altogether and kill animals without them ever reacting. Again, I have video proof of this working in 1.18. Did Tyrone see the video and nerf it? But it's still a strong trait to prevent animal aggression, especially against the bears, which is the biggest issue in the early game. The 50% detection range reduction against the bears is impressive. To pair with strong animal avoidance, we also have a minor foraging bonus, paired with a pretty hefty 20% extra seed drop rate. This makes starting a farming operation a lot easier, thus letting you secure the food supply a lot earlier, and gets you going with the ever-important flax. The cracked vessel bonuses are kinda whatever, unless you're doing some kind of challenge run like yours truly. If you get lucky, you can secure some extra gears with an intact vessel drop, or get a few more items out of each broken vessel. The exclusive sling is probably a bit underrated. It is similar to the crude bow, but with much easier ammo. I actually see myself using it in certain night situations after getting to play around with it a little. The Malefactor downsides are the same as the Clockmaker. They're certainly not great, but also not game-breaking in any meaningful way. The top spot is going to none other than the Hunter, packed with two incredibly strong traits. The movement speed I spoke about ad nauseum at this point, and focus trait makes him incredibly potent in range combat, making hunting real easy. The extra loot from animals is also helpful, especially with high yield and high variance meats from the bigger animals. His crude bow is usable, with having to nap the ammo being the biggest downside. The recurve bow, on the other hand, is the best ranged weapon in the game, beating even the steel melee weapons on the Blackguard in terms of damage output. I was heavily underrating the recurve on the Hunter and can see myself engaging in ranged combat more often from now on. His negatives of reduced melee damage are whatever, since the range damage is so good. The negative that reduces the ore drop rate is probably the worst negative on this class. This can affect your speed of transition to iron when looking for bronze alloys. Overall, it's the strongest starting class, but also probably the best and the most rounded class altogether. Now, I want to flip the script and talk about which classes are the best in the late game. I imagine this being at the end of year 1, and you probably have infinite food and produce your first batches of steel. The last place goes to the Malefactor, a big fall from grace. The Malefactor's positive traits don't really do much in the late game. You are probably not foraging, and seed production can be scaled through farming at this point. You don't need cracked vessels, and there are plenty of ways to make rusty gears through trading. The animal seeking range, while still being okay, becomes a lot less relevant once you get gambits and armor. Its tier 2 protection is usually enough to escape a bear attack. The sling does nothing at this stage, while the reduced melee damage, the decreased range, and the decreased hit points make him strictly worse at combat. Next spot goes to the Tailor. I considered placing the Tailor at the bottom instead of the Malefactor, but the Tailor has nothing affecting his combat capabilities, making him a little more potent in the end. Again, foraging is not relevant at this stage, and neither is hunting, since you can establish animal husbandry. The decreased mining speed is minor, and the exclusive recipes at least have aesthetic value in the endgame, unlike the sling. The next place goes to the Clockmaker. While he suffers the exact same downsides as the Malefactor, at least he gets 10% movement speed, which is relevant at all stages of the game. The ability to repair translocators a little cheaper could be okay at this stage as well, as you repair as many translocators as possible for maximum ability to move around. Moving to the top 3, the third place goes to the Commoner. The Commoner's lack of downsides in the endgame are actually pretty good. You can do anything at this point and be relatively good at it. I'm still not a fan of the Commoner and would never pick him over other classes. I would have placed the Clockmaker above it, but now that we have a riding mount, a new sailing ship, and Tyrone's promise of trains in the future, the movement speed does become a little less relevant in the endgame, and that brings the Commoner above the Clockmaker in my eyes. Second spot goes to the Hunter. Again, movement speed is really good, staying relevant in the endgame as well. But in addition, you are a powerhouse in range combat, making a recurve bow a real contender in the endgame. The reduced melee damage is fine, since you have the ranged weapons to lean back on, and the reduced ore drop rate and mining speed, while annoying, is not a huge deal at the endgame. And the top spot goes to the Blackguard. I think in the end, melee combat is more relevant than range combat. You will be forced into tight spots pretty often, and some enemies are less approachable with ranged weapons. This is the best melee class with the best melee damage. On top, it is also the tankiest with 5 extra health points. Mining speed also maintains some relevance, since mining is something you will be doing a lot pretty much forever. The downsides of hunger is not a big deal at this stage, and you will be favoring melee, thus range damage reduction is not a big deal. The reduction in foraging, cracked vessel loot, and drop seeds once again rapidly becomes irrelevant the further you are in the game. The exclusive craftables give you a little boost once you hit the iron stage, and the shield is technically the strongest shield in the game. The increased movement speed while wearing armor would be nice if it actually worked, but I assume it will be fixed in the future. Finally, the increased armor durability is just a little bonus. This class will have the highest ceiling, if you want to put it that way. This concludes my advanced class picking guide. This video ended up being a little larger than I anticipated. It was born of another idea. I was initially going to do advanced tactics for the game in general, but once I started writing my first section about the classes, I realized there's a whole video down here. I hope this video is of value to the community. I personally enjoyed making it and would love to do more videos deep diving advanced topics. Let me know in the comments section if it's something you want to see in the future. As far as what's next, I have an interview scheduled with QP Tech for my Vintage Voices series. Also, the 300 Days Plains and Valleys video won the community poll, and since this is a democracy, that is the video I will be producing after the QP Tech interview is edited. If you're still here, I love you. And on that note, Oscillascape is beaming out.